All right, we are very pleased to be here today with Dr. Hans Diehl. Dr. Hans Diehl is the founder of the Lifestyle Medicine Institute in Loma Linda, California, where he's also a clinical professor of preventative medicine at the School of Medicine in Loma Linda University. He is known for his pioneering efforts through his CHIP program, which is the Complete Health Improvement Program, where he's demonstrated the reversal of many chronic diseases, having worked with more than 80,000 people over the course of time. He's demonstrated these results in more than 40 published papers, and his books have sold more than 3 million copies around the world. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Diehl.
Public policy planners are becoming increasingly concerned about the rise in diabetes. Can you give us some idea of the diabetes prevalence trends in America?
Yeah, I mean, it has been a tremendous increase. Here, I'll give you some slides of the trend starting in 1994. You see the different states, at about 5% of the adults in America are now in 1994 have diabetes. 3 years later, it's 6%. 3 years later, it's 7%. 3 years later, it's 8%. 3 years later, it's 9%. And now it's over 9%. It's 10% of the American adults have diabetes.
So does this follow the obesity trends that we also see in the country?
Yeah, pretty much. Here you see in 1985, you see the prevalence of obesity among adults. And here you see in 1985, 10%, 1990, it's 10% plus, 1995, 15%, 2000 is 20%, 2005, it's 25%, and now it's over 30% of the American adults have obesity. And you begin to realize that this obesity thing is a new trend, because when you look at this slide here from 1900 to 1970, the width of a chair has been pretty much the same. But then something happened in the 1980s. Look at that.
Wow.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this then goes pretty much hand in hand with the epidemic of diabetes that really began to rise in the last 20, 30 years. Take a look at this one here, 1945 to 1985. There was very little change in the prevalence of diabetes, but suddenly it took a large surge up. And particularly when you look at the age categories from 45 to 65, these men and women, some 18% will have diabetes. When you look at those over 65, it's almost 30% of the people. And what is so stunning is that this all has happened in the last 20 years, where we have seen an increase of diabetes type 2 by 300%. You can see that diabetes has been advancing, doubling every 15 years. And when you have a baby born today, the chances are 1 out of 3 of these babies will develop diabetes in a lifetime. And we have no medical cure for this disease.
Wow, 1 out of 3. That's crazy.
Yeah, maybe you want to take a look at the absolute numbers. Here you see we probably have about 30 million diabetics in America. And 9 million don't even know they have it. They have not been diagnosed. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, you have 86 pre-diabetics. They're on their way to diabetes. So you're actually looking at 116 million diabetics, either full-blown diabetics or at risk, which means that every second adult has diabetes or is at risk for diabetes. That's why some people have called it the modern black plague of our century.
Wow, that's incredible. So, okay. How can adults, especially as they get older, if they know that they're going to be at an increased risk for developing diabetes, what can they do to actually, test for it? Are there warning signs? Are there markers? What can they do?
Yeah, you have the 3 P's. That's poly, many. Polydipsia, that's a lot of thirst. Polyphagia, lots of hunger. And then polyuria, that means lots of urination. So that's what you can look for. If you are very thirsty all the time, you're going to the bathroom quite often, you're hungry all the time, you have blurred eyesight, you're feeling tired, and oftentimes you have tingling in hands and feet. And on top of that, for men, oftentimes the first sign of developing diabetes is erectile dysfunction. It's almost something like the canary in a coal mine. You know that story, right? In the old days, there were poisonous gases in those underground mines, and they used to take a small bird, a canary, with them. And when the canary began to droop its head, they knew it was time to get up to get fresh air. And that's also what we find when it comes to erectile dysfunction. It is becoming the canary in the coal mine. It gives us a warning sign that this could very well be the result of diabetes.
Now, how about diabetes running in families? What about genetics connections?
Yeah, you know, everybody kind of thinks that this is all a matter of genetics, and there's nothing we can do about it. If it's genetics, what can you do? What people don't realize, it takes about 300 years to change the genetics in a society. But we have just talked about the idea that diabetes has doubled in just the last 20 years. So this is not so much a genetic disease. This is not something that's passed on to us, but it probably has to relate somehow to environmental factors. It's a little bit like obesity. You know, people always have the idea that obesity runs in my family, there's nothing I can do. I had a woman one time, one of my classes, and she was very, very upset that I downplayed the role of genetics. She was obviously very large, and she said, my grandparents were obese, my father and my mother, they're obese, I'm obese, my kids are obese, it's genetics. She was very upset at me. You know, I try to be a nice person, so I asked her the question. I said, do you mind if I check out a personal question? She said, be my guest. I said, okay, do you happen to have a dog? A dog? Yes. Oh, is a dog overweight? Yes. Is this genetics? And that settled the argument. You see, we oftentimes have the idea that we pass on only genetic factors. And so we say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. I picked the wrong parents. I picked the wrong grandparents. It's genetics. I can't do anything about it. Wait a minute. We're not just passing on genetics. We're also passing on recipes from one generation to the next. And maybe that might be more important than whatever genetic factors are there.
Yeah, that's a great response, actually. Tell us about what you have on this, the slide that you have on the screen right here. Basically, this is going to distinguish between pre-diabetes and full-blown diabetes. So can you tell us a little bit more about what's the distinguishing characteristics between the two?
Well, we talked a little bit about the subjective feelings, the markers of disease, being thirsty, being hungry, being tired. We talked about erectile dysfunction. But here is an objective test. This is how we define diabetes. Diabetes is anything above 125 for fasting blood sugar. That's diabetes. On the other hand, if you have a blood sugar below 100, that's considered to be healthy. So 70, 80, 90, 100 for fasting blood sugar, that's healthy. But if you're in between these two numbers, between 100 and 125, which is diabetes, then we define this as pre-diabetes. And these people usually become, in due time, full-blown diabetics. What diabetes does, it accelerates atherosclerosis, or the narrowing of the arteries. And so when you have arterial narrowing with the buildup of cholesterol and fats and so on, then you no longer bring adequate nutrition and oxygen to these target organs in the body, and they begin to deteriorate. And that's why we call sometimes this deterioration or degenerative diseases. It's not because we get older, it's just one of the factors, but it's because we are developing atherosclerosis, and diabetes tragically accelerates this process, so it affects our carotid arteries, our coronary arteries, our kidney arteries, all over the body. And that's what is really troubling us with diabetes. Because if diabetes indeed, as it does, promotes atherosclerosis, then we have to worry about the different organs. That's why diabetics have so much blindness. It's the #1 cause of blindness in Americans, blindness, diabetes. You have to worry about kidney disease, which is 18 times more common in diabetics. You have to worry about heart disease and stroke. You have to worry about impotence. You have to worry about foot and leg amputations. And you also have to worry about hearing impairment. You see, these are all the results where diabetes accelerates the narrowing of the arteries. And that's what's giving us a heartache. And that's why many people are considering diabetes the mother of all chronic diseases because it accelerates all of these diseases. And on top of that, it's not just the diseases, but you also pay a very high price in life expectancy. Here you see for men, they shorten their lifespan by about 11.6 years, women 14.3 years. And yet, just in case that you have the idea that, my goodness, this is all bad news today. Well, not really. I have some good news for you. And that is that 50 to 75% of these type 2 diabetics on insulin and 80 to 90% of them on pills could actually normalize their blood sugars and be off these medications within weeks if they change their diet. And then you ask the question then, well, why do we do this? Well, that's not a very easy answer to come by, but let me just give it a try. There are probably several reasons for this. We have to recognize that we as a system have failed to help people understand what diabetes really is and what the role of insulin is. Furthermore, we probably have oversold medications, these pills and injections, because they don't cure, and yet people don't really understand this. And then another one is that we probably have prescribed diabetics not the right diet. And so if you really want to understand diabetes, you have to really understand the role of insulin. And to do this, we have to recognize that insulin is a biochemical messenger that unlocks the doors of the muscle cells so that they can usher in the glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. Otherwise, the blood sugar builds up, and that's, of course, the diabetes. So here's a natural, a normal person. You can see the pink cell. It's surrounded by the dark bluish violet color. This is the circulatory system. And you have now the pancreas in the person producing insulin. The insulin locks onto the cell, and it is sort of like a door opener. It opens up the cells, and the glucose, the blood sugar that is on the outside of the cell now can get into the cell where it's needed. That's what you want. You need to have the tank filled with gas. And that's the way it is also with the human body. You need to get the glucose into the cells where it can do the work. That's how it's used. That's how it's supposed to work. However, in some people, the pancreas, which produces the insulin, is oftentimes no longer functional, particularly in young children, and or for some other reasons too. And so here now, you see the glucose molecule building up in the circulatory system, in the bloodstream. It cannot get into the cell, and the person now develops a coma. The blood sugar goes very, very high, and the person actually is doomed to die. Fortunately, this is only the case in 5% of all the diabetics. We call them type 1 or juvenile diabetics. These people are dependent on insulin that has to come from the outside. Now, when it comes to type 2 diabetes, that's a different kind of a category here. Here you see a person, the person is large. You see those little triangles. That means the pancreas is very, very active, is producing as much insulin as possible, more than is usually produced. And the pancreas tries desperately to bring more and more insulin to the to lock onto the cell, to open up these cellular gates, but it can't do it because somehow something is gumming up the locks. There's something where the insulin as a key cannot get into the lock and open it up. And so in the process, the pancreas goes into overdrive, and over the next 10, 15, 20 years produces more and more insulin, but the insulin is very insensitive. It cannot do the job, and ultimately the pancreas kind of fatigues, becomes inactive, it almost sort of burns out, and in some ways it becomes like a type 1 diabetic. And so what people have always thought is that if they can just get enough medication, then everything is fine. And so 62, 70, 80, 90% of the people that are diabetics are on medications, mostly on pills and on injections. And yet, they don't seem to understand that these drugs do not cure. They do not stop the epidemic, and they may actually be harmful. There's a powerful, large, highly respected study, the Carb study, which showed that the higher the drug dose given to diabetics to control their blood sugar, the greater was the harm in deaths and sickness. I mean, this is shocking. These drugs don't cure. And on top of that, almost all of these drugs, including the insulin, except maybe one or two, they always have the side effect of causing excessive hunger. So people now eat more because of the medication. As they get larger, their blood sugar rises more. So they have to take more medication. And so now you have this vicious cycle. And the drug industry now has a customer for life. These drugs don't cure. You only stop these drugs when you're passing off the scene. And yet, there are answers that are very powerful that could reverse this whole process within weeks. And then, of course, people ask the question, what about diet? Don't we prescribe therapeutic diets for diabetes? And here again, what we nowadays do, we prescribe usually for diabetics a diet that is fairly high in animal protein, which means it's also high in cholesterol and fat, which then actually promotes kidney disease and atherosclerotic diseases. So we have to develop a new concept of how to deal with diabetes, because the old approach is not working. Diabetes is becoming more and more and more. We have to go beyond just taking care of the blood sugar. We have to take care of the causes, and the causes have to do with what we eat and how we exercise. Now, let me give you a few ideas here of how diet and diabetes relates very well. Let me take you to some of the population studies. I'll take you around the world now. I'll take you to Japan. Here you see on this slide, before 1960, it was very difficult to find diabetes in Japanese men in Japan. Over the next 20, 30, 40 years, diabetes has increased by 15 times. Now 15% of the Japanese over 40s of age are diabetics. Is this genes? This is just 40 years. This is not genes. What happened in Japan? Here you take a look at the next slide. You see the yellow line? These are the carbohydrates. The carbohydrates have dropped dramatically in Japan because they have been taken over by the fat in the diet. We didn't only bring MacArthur after World War II to Japan, we also brought McDonald's and the fast food industry to McDonald's, and with that was a significant increase in fat consumption, animal products, and of course cholesterol. And with that, you now see an interesting, dramatic parallel motion of an increase in overweight, the red line, and you see a yellow line, the prevalence increase in diabetes. So we can make a pretty good case that whenever you come to societies where there's an increase in the fat consumption, animal products, and perhaps also sugar, there's always the problem of obesity. And with obesity, you also oftentimes have to be concerned about some of these chronic diseases. To give you a general idea, here's you see the diet composition of a society. On the left-hand side, you see the large green bar. This is mostly calories that come from unrefined complex carbohydrates or starchy foods. These are the corn and the potatoes and the beans and so on. And these foods gradually, as you move to the right, become changed as a country becomes more affluent. With an increase in money, we no longer eat potatoes, we eat potato chips. We no longer eat corn, we eat corn chips. We no longer eat beans, we eat burgers. But we no longer drink water, we drink soda pops. And with it, you see a dramatic shift towards the right-hand side, where now the diet in these countries is 30, 40% fats of any kind. You see a significant increase in sugar, usually 20 to 25%. And then the protein content, particularly because of the animal products, has gone up. And with it, you see a dramatic decline in starch. And whatever starch people eat in these societies now is highly refined starch, which is really not providing the usual fiber that you need in the diet to really use the different components properly. So in review, take a look at this slide. The more you become affluent in society, the more affluent people can become, the more you see a shift towards away from the whole foods you're moving now to fractionated processed foods, and you move towards more and more animal products. And with that, you have now a diet that's high in fat, it's high in sugar, it's high in animal protein, and it's whatever starch you have, it's highly refined white flour products. Whenever you have this kind of a diet composition, within 5 to 10 years, in a society that didn't have diabetes, you all of a sudden now see the beginning of diabetes and heart disease and so on and so forth. So this is the American diet. 51% of the calories comes from processed foods. 35% comes from animal products, largely dairy and animal products and eggs. And the point here is only 14% of our calories comes from unrefined foods, whole fruits, vegetables, whole grains and legumes. These are the foods that provide the fiber in our diet, which has been reduced to 12 grams a day in our society, and we probably should have more like 40 or 45 grams of fiber a day. In recent years, many questions have been raised about the role of fat and sugar in the diet. As a matter of fact, many people have wondered if the fat in the diet may not be one of the factors that has promoted the diabetic epidemic. Well, let me take you through some of the studies. I want to take you to 1927. There's a Dr. Sweeney. He did some incredible work. He had some medical students there, and he put them on two different kind of diets. He put them on a diet. He wanted to see which of these students will develop diabetes. And he gave them this 2-week experiment. The first group received a very high-fat diet, hash browns and salami and cheese and cream, ice cream, margarine, butter, high-fat foods. And then the other group of medical students, he gave them a high-carbohydrate diet. So lots of sugar, white flour products, candy, white bread, bananas. We also give them some baked potatoes, some brown rice and oatmeal and beans. All the foods that we usually tell people not to eat when they have diabetes. And here's what he found. He was absolutely shocked to find that within 2 weeks, the group of the high-fat diet with the hash browns and the cheese and the ice cream, they had developed the diabetes. It was a shocker. Of course, you moved to the high-fat foods, and these medical students normalized, while those on the high-carbohydrate diet, there was not one person developing some diabetes. Very, very interesting. Then you go to this was 1927. Then you go to 1935. There's a British physician, highly respected. He found that as he changed the fat in the diet, the diabetes began to change because somehow the sensitivity to insulin was dramatically increased. So here we have now 2 suggestions that maybe fat is involved. Then you go to Harvard, you have a famous study with 85,000 pre-diabetics. They followed them for 16 years. And out of these pre-diabetics, 3,000 became full-blown diabetics. And here's the outcome. This is 16 years later, 91% of those who became diabetics, it was all related to lifestyle, particularly overweight. Overweight in these patients characterized the people who became diabetics. So obesity is a problem. The fat on the diet, so fat is a problem. It's a fat apparently in the cells because it gums up, as we now understand, the cellular mechanisms. But then also the fat that's on the body is a problem. So here we go now to the famous DPP metformin study. Here's again, they took 3,000 some obese pre-diabetics, followed them for 3 years. They put them on 3 different regimens. Number 1, they said, you're in the control group, we don't do anything. And 29% of these obese pre-diabetics became diabetics, 29%. Then they had a group on metformin. That's a very popular diabetes drug. And in this case, only 21% became diabetics. So this was obviously helpful. But then they had a third group, and they called this a lifestyle group. And they suggested to them to begin to lose some weight, get into a 30-minute exercise program every day. And in this case, in the 3 years, 14% of these people became diabetics. So obviously, the lifestyle group exceeded the effectiveness of the metformin very significantly. And then you have another large study at Harvard with 200,000 people. They followed them for 10 years, and they found that as little as 2 ounces of processed red meat a day increased diabetes by 50%. Of all the factors, nothing was as powerful in increasing chances of developing diabetes as 2 ounces of processed red meat. Why? We're still arguing over this, but obviously meat has no fiber. And meat also is fairly high in fat. So we begin to look at these things now, and then it takes us to Loma Linda University, to conducted a major study with some close to 100,000 people. And you know, the interesting thing about the Adventist population in North America, most of these people are meat eaters, but some of them are vegans, some of them are lacto-ovo vegetarians, and some of them are fish-eating vegetarians. And here's what they found. They found those Adventists, they have a similar lifestyle except in the area of diet. Those Adventists that were meat-eating Adventists had 6.3% among them as diabetics. And as you go down to less and less and less animal products, you end up on the pure vegetarian green bar there, only 1.6%, which means that the Adventist meat eaters had 400% more diabetes than those who were pure vegetarians. And so we know that we can prevent this disease. We know it's preventable, but the question is, what would happen if we use this diet, this lifestyle that prevents diabetes? Could it also reverse diabetes? That's the question. And I want to take you to 4 or 5 studies now. As we review this, we go back to 1933. Again, we have known this for many, many years, almost for 100 years, that when you take people off the high-fat diets, they no longer need the insulin to the same extent as diabetics. 1955, a physician by the name of Inder Singh took 80 patients on insulin, put them on a very low-fat whole foods diet. I mean, the fat content was 10, 11%. Our diet today is more like 35 to 40%. So this was a very low-fat whole food diet. And within 6 weeks, 50 out of these 80 insulin-using patients were off the insulin. 6 weeks, no more need for insulin. This is unheard of. Over the next 18 weeks, all in all, 85% of these type 2 diabetics on insulin were no longer in need of any insulin. This is a very powerful study. Then you had Dr. Anderson. He is the man that has written over 500 scientific papers and books and has said over and over again, if we would take people towards a more whole food, plant-based diet, we probably could change diabetes in 45 to 85% within weeks, and they would be off their insulin and off their drugs. He took 28 patients on insulin. He fed them a very simple diet, very high in fiber, lots of starch, but no refined starch. This was unrefined starch, starch as it comes in nature, corn and grains. And within 3 weeks, 22 out of these 28 diabetics on insulin were off the insulin, again showing that there's something to be said about the amount of starch, the right starch, and the right amount of fiber in the diet, and of course low fat. And that takes us to Nathan Pritikin, 1983. He had patients there in his center for 4 weeks. He fed them a very, very simple diet, foods as grown, unrefined foods, largely plant-based, and 44% of these patients with type 2 diabetes on insulin were able to go off insulin in 4 weeks, and 74% of patients on type 2 diabetes on oral drugs no longer in need of any medication. And then that brings us to Neil Barnard's work in 1994. He did the same kind of a program. High fat was out, low fat was in, high fiber was in, and 71% of these type 2 diabetics were able to stop their oral drugs in 26 days of following a plant-based diet. And we have the same thing with our CHIP program. Here you see we had 525 diabetics, and as they followed a 4-week program of very simple foods as grown, after just 4 weeks, there were only 301 diabetics. These other 224 diabetics were no longer diabetic. They had reversed the disease process, and as they followed through on the program, there should be no problem. So what's the magic? After giving you all of these results here, we talked about preventing disease, We talked about reversing diabetes with a diet that also prevents diabetes. What's the magic? Here's some of the final slides. We have misunderstood the different carbohydrates. We have always known there are simple carbohydrates, these are the sugars, and there are complex carbohydrates, the starches. But we have never made the distinction between refined carbohydrates and unrefined carbohydrates. And that makes all the difference, because when you take foods that have sugar, such as fruits, and you eat them as whole foods, these are the good carbs. The body can handle these carbohydrates. But the moment you refine these sugar-containing carbohydrates, you now have white sugar or brown sugar or honey. They're now refined, and they create this sugar rush in the body, and the insulin is being poured out, and the body doesn't know what to do with it. On the other hand, you have the same thing with the starches. If you take white flour, if you take a refined starch, it's refined, it converts into sugar very rapidly. It causes the blood sugars in the body to go up, and the body's producing a lot of insulin, and that gives us the problem, ultimately leading to insulin insensitivity. On the other hand, if you take starches as they come in nature, as you eat the whole grain, as you eat the corn, as you eat the potatoes, as you eat the beans, they're loaded with starch, and that makes all the difference. You see, the magic ingredient here is low fat, high fiber, because the fiber slows down the digestion and the absorption of the sugars and the starches. Pancreas then can handle this with great ease, and the body just hums and works beautifully. In our CHIP program, about 65 to 70% of our calories come from unrefined complex carbohydrates, and also some of the sugars as you find it in the fruits and vegetables. And here you see the last couple of slides. You want to get away from the red triangle. You want to get away from the American Western diet. You want to cut back on meats and dairy and eggs and processed foods. You want to cut back on alcohol and caffeine. And you want to get more and more into the green category. You want to eat more fruits and vegetables. You want to eat plenty of legumes. I mean, legumes, I mean beans and lentils, they're magically high in fiber. And then of course you have the whole grains, again high in fiber. And when it comes to nuts and seeds, they're good nutrition, but you want to use them in small amounts and plenty of water. And then of course, don't forget to get your exercise. And so the prescription for preventing and reversing type 2 diabetes is a whole food, plant-strong diet. Don't forget your exercise, particularly after every meal. You should walk 5, 10, 15 minutes. This offers you, this combination of a simple foods as grown plus exercise program offers you the single most powerful and the most effective remedy to prevent, to treat, and to reverse type 2 diabetes. And that often within weeks. Here's Professor Anderson, remember? The man who made the comments in 1980, the man who wrote over 500 scientific papers and books. He said some 50 to 75% of insulin-using type 2 diabetics and 80 to 90% of those on pills could normalize their blood sugars and be off these pills within weeks. All you have to do is change your diet. Blessings on all of you as you think about the importance of fiber and the importance of a low-fat diet and daily exercise.
All right, Hans, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you taking the time to lead us through the research. And like you said, there's more than 85 years worth of evidence-based research to show that it's actually refined foods and higher fat foods that actually set the stage for diabetes. And we really appreciate your time being here with us today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.